Currently, we are witnessing large-scale demolition drives under the name of Bulldozer action across many parts of India. Initially, much of the focus was on the removal of roadside vendors, informal shops, and structures near railway premises and public roads. Many people on social media celebrated these actions, describing them as long overdue measures to restore order and legality. Now the bulldozers have increasingly moved towards urban housing settlements and informal neighborhoods. Many who once applauded the demolition of vending spaces are now finding themselves vulnerable to the same process. Meanwhile, those who remain untouched often continue to derive a certain moral satisfaction from these actions. For them, this is simply the law taking its course, an ethical government finally acting against illegality. But is the issue really that simple? Can these developments be understood only through the narrow lens of legality? Before addressing that question, we must first ask, why were these vendors, settlements, and so-called illegal structures allowed to emerge and expand in the first place? Was Indian urbanization always shaped in this manner? There was a time when urban settlement in India was more consciously linked to planned social and industrial development under the direction of the state. Industries were established in designated zones, and worker housing was often developed alongside factories, mines, and industrial centers. Schools, hospitals, transport systems, markets, and civic infrastructure were integrated into these projects to varying degrees. Public sector industrial townships such as Bhilai, Bokaro, Durgapur, and Rourkela reflected this model of coordinated development, where urban growth was connected to the reproduction of the workforce and broader social needs rather than left entirely to private profit. Railway colonies across the country similarly represented an older framework in which employment and housing were institutionally linked through public planning. This system was far from perfect. Housing shortages, uneven development, bureaucratic inefficiency, and informal settlements existed even during earlier decades of planned development. Yet urbanization was still understood, at least partially, as a social responsibility of the state rather than merely an outcome of market forces. Over time, however, neoliberal economic thinking increasingly reshaped policymaking. Political leaders, economists, sections of academia, and generations of students were taught that centralized planning itself was inefficient and outdated, and that markets should determine the direction of economic expansion. The role of the state was gradually reduced from that of a provider and planner to that of a facilitator of private investment and business growth. Private capital, however, had little interest in developing integrated urban communities for workers beyond what was immediately necessary for production and profit. Affordable housing, public health infrastructure, sanitation, education, and dignified living conditions increasingly ceased to be treated as collective responsibilities. Workers were effectively told to secure survival individually through the market. As economic liberalization accelerated, urban growth increasingly took the form of speculative real estate expansion and informal settlement growth rather than coordinated social planning. In cities like Mumbai and Delhi, millions of migrant workers were pushed into slums, unauthorized colonies, informal rental arrangements, and precarious settlements because formal urban housing remained economically inaccessible. Dharavi in Mumbai, often described as one of Asia's largest informal settlements, became not only a symbol of urban poverty, but also a major center of informal production and labor deeply integrated into the city's economy. This process generated enormous opportunities for unregulated real estate interests, land speculation, and politically mediated encroachments. Across expanding cities and industrial corridors, densely populated and poorly serviced settlements emerged without adequate sanitation, drainage, environmental safeguards, or civic planning. Urban sprawl intensified ecological degradation, strained public infrastructure, and produced highly unequal living conditions. Yet these very settlements became indispensable to the functioning of the neoliberal urban economy. Millions of workers employed in construction, transportation, domestic labor, delivery services, small manufacturing, street vending, repair work, and other informal sectors were forced to inhabit these spaces because the system depended upon cheap labor, while refusing to guarantee dignified living conditions. What is often described as unplanned urbanization was therefore not merely an administrative failure or accidental disorder. It was deeply connected to an economic model that prioritized profit, deregulated expansion, and private accumulation over socially coordinated urban development. At the same time, governments frequently tolerated, and at times politically cultivated, these settlements for decades through selective regularization, patronage networks, and electoral calculations. Informal settlements often existed in a condition of permanent insecurity, useful as reservoirs of cheap labor and vote banks, but denied stable legal recognition. Another important question emerges from these anti-encroachment drives. If roadside vendors, informal shopkeepers, and small livelihood spaces are removed from government land, will they actually be provided with designated spaces to continue their business activities? That is what even the law of the land increasingly prescribes through rehabilitation mechanisms and regulated vending provisions. But can governments practically provide such spaces on a meaningful scale today? How can they, when long-term social planning and land management have steadily weakened over decades? Land reform itself was supposed to be one of the major foundations of planned development after independence. The Indian state introduced various land reform measures, including Jamindari abolition and land ceiling laws, under which large concentrations of land were meant to be brought under public regulation and redistributed more equitably. But how much of this was actually implemented in practice? In states like West Bengal, land consolidation and tenancy reforms under initiatives such as Operation Barga at least partially weakened older landlord structures and expanded state control over sections of land administration. That historical process still influences the ability of governments to intervene in land use and reclaim land today. But what about many other states where land reforms remained weak, incomplete, or largely symbolic? In several regions, large landholders and entrenched rural elites continued to retain enormous control over land and rent extraction even after formal reforms. At the same time, governments failed to systematically acquire and reserve land for affordable housing, worker settlements, regulated vending zones, and future urban expansion. As urban populations expanded rapidly, millions were pushed towards informal settlements, roadside vending, unauthorized markets, and precarious occupations because planned alternatives simply did not exist at the required scale. This creates a deep contradiction within present anti-encroachment politics. Governments seek to remove informal occupations in the name of legality and urban order, but often lack the planned public infrastructure and land reserves necessary to rehabilitate the same populations they are displacing. The labor of these populations remains economically necessary, yet the urban system continues to deny them secure and dignified spaces within the city itself. As a result, legality increasingly functions in a selective manner. Informal survival spaces created through decades of policy failure, uneven development, and inadequate planning are suddenly treated as individual acts of criminal encroachment, while the deeper structural causes behind their emergence remain largely untouched. Another important aspect rarely discussed is what happens after the demolition drives are completed. Even if large stretches of encroached land are cleared, how exactly will governments restore or utilize these spaces in practice? Over decades, unregulated urban expansion and informal construction proliferated like mushrooms across cities and peri-urban regions, often undermining original urban plans, natural drainage systems, wetlands, canals, estuaries, floodplains, and ecological buffers. Roads, settlements, commercial structures, and speculative real estate gradually expanded into spaces that historically performed important environmental functions. In many cases, the damage has already become structural and in some places possibly irreversible. Natural drainage channels have narrowed or disappeared entirely, water bodies have been fragmented, groundwater recharge systems have weakened, and densely built urban clusters now exist in ecologically fragile zones. Seasonal flooding, waterlogging, heat accumulation, sanitation crises, and collapsing civic infrastructure are not simply the result of individual encroachments alone, but of decades of chaotic and uneven urbanization carried out without long-term ecological planning. This creates another contradiction. Governments now attempt to reclaim land in the name of restoring order, legality, and environmental balance, but many of these natural systems have already been permanently altered through decades of administrative neglect, speculative expansion, political patronage, and unplanned growth. The question, therefore, is not merely whether demolitions should or should not occur. The deeper question is why urban development was allowed to reach such a stage in the first place, where both human settlement and ecological systems were pushed into forms of crisis that are now extremely difficult to reverse. This does not mean that every demolition or anti-encroachment action is inherently unjustified. Certain structures may genuinely obstruct drainage systems, create dangerous living conditions, violate environmentally sensitive zones, or emerge through land marshes and politically protected corruption. No society can function entirely without regulation or urban planning. But the question remains, why does the burden of legality fall so disproportionately upon the poor after decades of state neglect, selective enforcement, and institutional complicity? Why are informal workers criminalized for occupying urban spaces while large-scale corporate violations, speculative land accumulation, and elite encroachments often receive accommodation, legalization, or silence? The issue, therefore, cannot be reduced to a simplistic binary of legality versus illegality. These demolitions must also be understood within the broader political and economic history of Indian urbanization, a history in which the state increasingly withdrew from its social responsibilities while continuing to rely upon the labor of populations it never meaningfully integrated into planned urban life. The same system that benefits from informal labor often refuses to recognize the humanity and permanence of the people who sustain it. Bulldozer politics emerges not merely as a question of law enforcement, but as a reflection of deeper contradictions within contemporary urban development itself. How then can this crisis be addressed? The immediate rehabilitation and resettlement of uprooted hawkers, vendors, and displaced working populations must become a central priority rather than an afterthought. Demolition and eviction drives should not proceed in a mechanical manner without first ensuring viable alternative arrangements for livelihoods and shelter. Otherwise, displacement merely reproduces the same cycle of informality in new locations. At the same time, the contradiction between homelessness and speculative urban vacancy must also be confronted seriously. Across many cities, large numbers of housing units remain vacant for speculative or investment purposes, while millions continue to live in slums, temporary settlements, and highly precarious conditions. Socially oriented housing policies and stronger public intervention in urban land use are necessary if cities are to function as spaces of human habitation rather than merely as instruments of real estate accumulation. Until broader social transformation takes place, several immediate measures are necessary to protect the lives and livelihoods of millions of people. No demolition without rehabilitation. implementation of planned vending zones and rehabilitation mechanisms, expansion of affordable public housing, social use and regulation of vacant speculative housing stock, accountability for developers, land mafias, and corrupt administrative networks, recognition of informal labor as essential urban labor. At the same time, several long-term structural measures are also necessary. Democratic and socially oriented urban planning, land reform and the creation of public land reserves for future urban needs, protection and restoration of wetlands, drainage systems, flood-prone areas, and environmentally sensitive zones. A shift from punitive urbanism toward inclusive and environmentally sustainable urban development. But ultimately, minor reforms alone cannot resolve this crisis. The roots of informal urbanization lie in questions of land, unequal development, and the weakening of social planning. As long as state institutions and the entire framework of urban development continue to operate with profit as their central objective, neither a just resolution of the land question, nor democratic urban planning, nor the protection of workers' livelihoods, nor ecological restoration can be fully achieved. But the question remains: who will implement these measures? At times, under the pressure of worker struggles, the capitalist class is compelled to introduce reforms that benefit working people. Yet as soon as those movements weaken, the reform process often slows down, is diluted, or begins to be reversed. Therefore, the only permanent solution to this crisis lies in overcoming the capitalist system that gave rise to it. In its place must emerge a social order centered on human labor and human dignity, rather than the endless pursuit of wealth accumulation. A society where the happiness of one is not built upon the suffering of millions, but where the happiness of each is bound to the happiness of all, and the happiness of all enriches the happiness of each.